It's good morning from Belfast and good afternoon, I know, for a number of you. So, I just want to take 15 minutes just to highlight some of the concepts and theories that Dimitri was alluding to. I'm just simply entitling this The Long War, which it was a long war of 30 years, and the long peace, because we're 26 years into a peace process. Not dissimilar to most conflicts, we had the normal three concepts of land, identity, and religion were part of our conflict. Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, or the six counties, we still don't agree today on what to call it. Not dissimilar to the Middle East. Was it the Nakba? Was it the War of Independence? So we're not even agreed on what we call the space in which we actually live at the moment. Over that period of 30 years, we had a population just of 1.5 million, 47,000 injuries, 37,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system, and with almost 4,000 deaths. Those statistics probably seem tiny to many people's minds, but often when I'm in the United States, I extrapolate those figures. So, very simply put, if the Northern Ireland conflict had happened in the United States over a 30-year period, you would have had 700,000 dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. Let me just talk a little about the kind of Good Friday Agreement. And I've often used the work of the late Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi, as many of you know, to the British Commonwealth. Sacks had this brilliant quotation where he said, "Weapons win wars, but it takes ideas to win peace." Weapons win wars, but it takes ideas to win peace. The word reconciliation that Dimitri has alluded to there is a kind of feel-good word, it seems at times, and yet I've often argued that reconciliation is anything but feel-good. A theologian of another generation said, reconciliation is no cheap matter. It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences. Reconciliation presupposes confrontation. Without that, we do not get reconciliation, but merely a temporary glossing over of differences. So the running sores of society cannot be healed with the use of a band-aid or a sticking plaster. Because reconciliation, I want to suggest, presupposes an operation, a cutting to the very bone without anesthetic or anesthesia, because the infection is not just on the surface. So I've often argued over the years or tried to develop a theory that I call a multidisciplinary approach to building peace. Because many people work on the assumption that if we get a legal framework, all will be well. We get an agreement, set up certain institutions politically, that all will be well. As a colleague of mine said in relation to the law, the law cannot heal. Law is not a therapy. The law can create a space. The reality is that law and fact are weak when you're dealing with powerful emotions. So I want to say, in relation to what I call a multidisciplinary approach to peace, you need academics at the table. You need business people, you need politicians, you need women's groups, but you need all our various academic disciplines. You need philosophy, you need history, you need psychology, you need theologians, all feeding into that space. The biggest thing we're dealing with at the moment, 26 years, as Dimitri has said, after the end of our conflict, is the role of legacy, memory. How do we get the architecture to deal with the past? As a colleague of mine rightly alluded to, he said, if truth is the first casualty of war, as it is, perspective is often the first casualty of peace. So how do we deal with memory? I've often suggested there's a danger of too much memory. Memory also, naturally, we all know this, tends to be very, very selective. But furthermore, memory can be manipulated. I actually did a project that my colleague Dimitris were off with the social psychology department at Tel Aviv, where we twinned British Irish victims with Israeli Palestinian victims over a period of time. And we tried to look at what we were calling deep remembering. How do we remember in a less destructive way? And it came out of an article that a colleague of mine, a professor there at Tel Aviv University, Nurit, wrote in her writs entitled Inclusive Victimhood versus Competitive Victimhood. It's interesting, how do we explode in reconciliation what I call myths and stereotypes? The brilliant Israeli diplomat Ben-Ami said that collective psychology, national myths, and the perception that a given group might have of its enemy have always been major factors in the decision to go to war. So stories are not just historical stories. They're stories that shape our spiritual health, our mental health, our internal and our external psychology, and ultimately the way we behave and the way we actually think. So I want to suggest that one of the key components to our peace process has been creating what we call once upon a time moments. I mean, science has long proven that storytelling is one of the most effective mechanisms for dealing with the past. Let me just highlight for a couple of moments, because time's slipping on, a process that was developed by a close friend of mine, a leading psychologist at Queen's University, called the civic society peace process, or the social peace process, versus the political peace process. Good Friday Agreement is signed 26 years ago, April the 10th, 1998. Our devolved assembly has been down, not functioning, 44% of the time. I mean, it's literally just up, as you guys know. I mean, most of the world's news sources pick that up. It's just up after another 2 year where it was put again into hibernation. People often ask me, Gary, if you haven't had a government for 44% of the time, why have you not gone back to conflict? And I've often said quite strongly that, to my mind, that civic society is actually the social glue that holds our peace process together. Because the theory goes like this. Politicians work in the assumption that the negotiated settlement, everything is done and dusted. I mean, let's be honest, there's few of any negotiated settlements deal with what I call social healing, social relationship building, civic society repair, replacement of brokenness by the development of tolerance and compromises. So we need a social peace process that includes truth and reconciliation procedures, forgiveness and atonement strategies, public tolerance, memorialization, remembering, cultural systems, flags, re-evaluation of identity. The problem in most negotiations, as has been rightly pointed out, is that they are either ignored by negotiators or they work on the assumption that they will flow naturally from the signing of the agreement itself. I think it's a pretty naive assumption that once you sort out problematic politics, societal healing automatically occurs. And in reality, the day the Good Friday Agreement was signed, way back April 10th, 1998, George Mitchell, the American Democratic senator from Maine, in a throwaway comment, which was incredibly true and prophetic, said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and it was, implementing it will be even more difficult. So as I sit here in Belfast today at 1 p.m, I've been meeting with colleagues from the Irish government, looking at the ongoing implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. Because if you focus just on the political peace process, the domain is naturally political. Governments, political actors. But if you realize there is a social peace process, a need for healing within society, peace processes become the responsibility of people like me and others who live in societies emerging out of conflict and the domain in which they function. So in reality, in the early 1990s, and I'll pick a couple of sentences and then finish, in the early 1990s, after killing each other for 22, 23 years, we ended up with a mutually hurting stalemate. So very simply put, the British Army, one of the most efficient military machines on planet Earth, were not going to defeat the IRA, non-state actors. The IRA were never going to defeat the British Army. And the non-state actors on the pro-British side, Ulster Volunteer Force, Ulster Defence Association, were not going to defeat the IRA. So there wasn't going to be any outright military victory. We could have killed each other for another 50 years. Colonel Gaddafi had sent in tons of weaponry to the IRA. The loyalist groupings had obtained weaponry from South Africa. So there's enough weaponry in the island of Ireland to continue this thing for another 50 years. So what were the things, just very, very briefly, that I'll highlight, and then I'll pass over to my next colleague. I've got 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians in Belfast in the last 10 years. And they often highlight to me, not me to them, 5 lessons very quickly. They do highlight, naturally, that political leadership is essential to achieving peace, that leaders on both sides of the political divide took thoughtful strategic risks. They said that change was preferable to the status quo. The second thing was there was a desire to break the continuous cycle of violence and save future generation from the horrors of conflict that emerged. Every Israeli and Palestinian has said to me in Belfast and Dublin, and I've had all shades of opinion, the Likud, Arab Joint List, Jewish Home, academics, women's groups, NGOs. They all said, Gary, you're not getting this. You don't understand. Israelis and Palestinians don't trust each other. And I go, really? Do you really think the first time in the late 80s when some of us went into a room, like we were hugging each other, we were popping bottles of champagne, we hated each other? But you cannot continue to use this excuse of not trusting the other person as an excuse for not beginning the process. Fourth thing I highlight is that all our attempts to resolve the conflict through military force were ultimately futile. And they didn't result in lasting security for either community. How did we achieve real security? When dialogue was prioritized, but most importantly, the root causes of the conflict were addressed. And the fifth and final lesson that colleagues in the Middle East say to me is the role of civic society, the social peace process. And that's why really the MEPA fund that was set up there in the United States was modeled on the International Fund for Ireland. I think statistically and financially, $16 has been put into the Israeli-Palestinian region for every person living there. $16. For the Northern Irish peace process, it's something like $80. The investment we had in our peace process was phenomenal. Europe, the United States, billions of dollars were put into this space to what I say to break up the hardened soil of sectarianism and hatred to allow meaningful human engagement to begin. Look, I'm over my 15 minutes. I'm conscious of time, but I know we have a discussion later and we can drill into some of those concepts in a bit more detail.
Gary, maybe you also would like to comment on my question, whether there was what's the reason for such a tight timing? And another question specifically to Northern Ireland. You started your speech saying you extrapolated the victims the victims of Northern Ireland to the United States situation, and we heard that you're speaking about millions of people in terms of casualties, and it's a lot. And yes, it pushes people to do something about it. But still, what if we would get into the mind of the British, Irish, American politicians who dealt with the situation? What would you, from a moral point of view, from a humane point of view, what would you say were, again, as with the private entrepreneurs? What was the driving force behind them? I mean, they had their own business. They could do, they could continue with their own business, with their own political agenda in their respective countries and not deal with Northern Ireland. What was the factor which influenced them the most?
A lot of it, Dimitri. I'll take the second question first. I mean, looking at the early 90s, it was simply the theory of the role of third parties in resolving conflict. In 1985, we had the Anglo-Irish Agreement between the UK and the Irish government. We needed, and people in my community, I grew up in that British Unionist community, went ballistic because they saw it as outside interference. That was 85. Then Downing Street Declaration. And then there was a statement by a British politician, Peter Brooke, who was British Secretary of State, in the most obscure dinner in London, nothing to do with politics. It was like the steelworkers' dinner, where he said this here. As a British government, we have no economic, selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland. It is not against a united Ireland we set our face, but against the means that the IRA are using, namely terrorism or political violence, to pursue that. That began to change the dynamic, where a politician was basically indirectly, I guess, Michael, apologising for the past, or British colonialism worldwide. So what they were really saying to those within the IRA Republican movement was that we're not there for economic strategic interests. And if a new dispensation politically comes about, we will not stop it. In other words, they were saying, pursue your political goals not through armed struggle, but through politics. So the third parties thing is interesting, and I know we're not going to drill into the Israeli-Palestinian theatre at the moment, but I did say to a colleague, actually McCall, in the State Department a few weeks ago, when you look at tiny, tiny Northern Ireland, 1.6 million people, we needed the Americans, we needed the Canadians, we needed the Australians, we needed the Europeans to help us get over the line. So I was just suggesting, once the war is over, the day after, as is used in the Middle East, the phraseology at the moment, what is the role of the international community? Because we were not capable of dealing with this for ourselves. We were traumatized, both Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, I'm in the region a lot. As I said, about 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians. Of conversations mostly with colleagues in the Middle East. Both Israelis and Palestinians are incredibly traumatized. As we were traumatized in the early 1990s, after decades of neighbour killing neighbour. We needed outside. And as you said, Dimitri, this place is not utopia. But the life my kids have now is phenomenally different to the life that I am in relation to that. Looking just at the second question, just to respond to Or and Mikhail's comments there. I mean, I will never do a PhD at my age, it's impossible, but I keep saying to students, honestly, or Mikhail, I would look at the role of memory in conflict transformation. How we actually deal with memory and the power of story. I mean, David Reith, the New York journalist book there that you know, called In Praise of Forgetting, and he's not talking about what he calls shameful amnesia. But he wrote a brilliant article in The Guardian, so anyone is listening, and this is free if you don't want to buy the book, it's called The Cult of Memory, When History Does More Harm Than Good. The Cult of Memory, When History Does More Harm Than Good. So, in our space at the moment, 26 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we are still weaponizing history. When I have Israelis or Palestinians there, they see paintings, as I often say, of what the other side did to us, never what we did to them. So how do we deal in this process with weaponizing history? Just to address Mikhail's point there as well, in the Good Friday Agreement, to a degree, we minimize the whole concept of transitional justice, or minimize legacy, or minimize dealing with the past. I understand the reasons. Trying to get these politicians over the line was not easy. We had to deal with weapons decommissioning, we had to deal with reform of policing, we had to deal with release of prisoners. So as you know, Mikhail, or the kind of legacy thing got pushed down the road. Another reason there, Dimitri, just to say that apologies were issued. 1994, the Combined Lawless Military Command, terrorist non-state actors used the phrase, "We express abject and true remorse to all innocent victims of the conflict." The IRA in 2002 followed it up, again, using the phrase, "all innocent victims of the conflict." Now, the reason for that being was, at that stage, we were still just not even out of conflict in 94, but by 2002 there was some optimism. Remember, when terrorist groups move off the stage, they have a very difficult dance in keeping their spoilers or detractors on board. So if they come out too quickly with apologies, particularly against police and British Army that they killed, they're going to empower or give a second wind to those who think the decision was wrong to go into politics in the first place. So it's a very delicate dance in relation to that. So you don't want to empower the kind of purest psychopathic terrorists when you do these apologies. So there's a timing issue there as well. But I do take Mikhail's point there that if that had been built into the Good Friday Agreement, perhaps we wouldn't be having, 26 years later, the conversations that I'm having almost on a daily basis. But it's also keeping the lunatic fringe, to describe it, of terrorist organisations on board. You don't want to give them power, then them going to the people that bought into the political process and saying they're apologising to people that murdered you. So it's a question of timing. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Gary, thank you very much.
Gary, you said that that the role of the international community is going to be very important in the upcoming months here in Israel, but I think the comparison is also a little difficult to Northern Ireland, because you have been mentioning the mutual hurting stalemate that was there. And I think that after this war we will have a stalemate, yes, but not a mutually hurting stalemate. And I think this makes people, bring up the very concessions that you have been mentioning. And now it just also...
I suppose looking at international conflicts, Max, there's none that are identical. But I know I'm involved in a project at the moment in Boston, and we're from 1945 to 2018. Every conflict on planet Earth was researched. You're talking like 278, ludicrous amount, unbelievable. And in this project, about 8 of them have a degree of applicability to the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. They're not identical, but there are possible lessons that may be learnt in relation to that. One example of that was in 1996, a number of our politicians went to South Africa to look at the dismantling of apartheid. Now, they were not identical. In fact, they wouldn't even travel in the same plane. They wouldn't eat their meals together. They wouldn't travel in the same buses. But they come back with one concept, and it's a moral concept. They come back with a belief and a hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Now, as an outsider looking in to the region you're in at the moment, it's as almost, there's no hope. Are we destined forever to be in this perpetual state of war? You don't want to reach 800 years as we did until it was resolved, but in what way can this be resolved? The mutually hurting stalemate thing is interesting. And I mean, I say this without mentioning names. I've often used that phrase, particularly in Tel Aviv, pre-October the 7th, of course. And colleagues have said to me, Gary, we're not hurting enough. In other words, the rawness of the Israeli-Palestinian theatre was not affecting people in Tel Aviv to a high degree. That's not minimizing what has happened in the past. This is not me saying this. These are Tel Avivans saying this to me. As I look at your situation now, and I'm not saying, so many Israelis died, so many Palestinians died, so we're not doing a head count of numbers to say who is hurting more. I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is that everyone is traumatized. And I think maybe, just maybe, and it is maybe, just maybe, out of that, the leadership on both sides and within the international community may be shown to move this forward. I mean, I can't say this definitively, and no one can contradict me in this. No one tomorrow is going to text my colleagues here, Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, or any university and say, got it, here's the resolution to the Middle East. Most of us have some idea. Is it one state, two states, one homeland, annexation, God forbid, but with some idea? It's leadership. To me, as a person who spent 35 years of my life in this stuff in some of the sharpest, most difficult areas of Belfast in an urban setting, it's leadership in the public space. And in our space, people who pursued terrorism or political violence in the early 90s were making statements or signals, there must be another way. And for me, that's key, because if we're doing numbers, I can give you numbers. IRA killed 60% of people in our conflict. Loyalist groupings killed 30%. State actors killed 10%. I mean, we all know that. But at the end of the day, for us to move out of this, we had to get away with, you did this, you did that. We all know that. And we had to say, is there a possible way forward? Or to put it bluntly, are we going to dump all this junk on the next generation? I had my first grandchild in October. I do not want Annabelle growing up the way I grew up. And my kids are not growing up the way I grew up either. But most peace processes take 50 years to implement. 50 years. We're only 26 years into the process. And that's why most of my life is not spent with people of my generation. I'm pouring my life into young Palestinians, young Israelis, young British, and young Irish. And we're not even going to go near the United States today either. But as you look at that region, when I'm working there, I'm actually trying to pour my life into people in their 20s and 30s. Because if things go badly wrong in the United States, they're going to be the generation that will build the peace. God forbid it ever happens. But the US is not in a pretty place either at the moment. I mean, a person came out the other day and said, we need a civil war. A leading evangelical preacher. We need a civil war? Really? Talk to me about a civil war. Terrified going to school. Going to sleep at night listening to bombs and bullets. You guys know what it's like. So we need leadership in the public square, both politically and within a civic framework. Or we condemn ourselves and the next generation, as we call it here, to a 30-year holiday in hell. And we need to take risks.